In today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how step by step you can draw and color this professional looking anime eye. I suggest you sit down on your art tablet and draw alongside with me in case you have nothing to do today. The brushes I use in this video are in my Patreon in the description. They are free, so don't worry, you don't have to pay a cent. Now, let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is sketch a general shape for our eye. As many of other artists have probably told you, eyes come in many different shapes, all depending on what kind of personality you want to give your character. For example, you can use a parallelogram for more like mature characters. If you want your character to always look angry, you can come up with this kind of like almond shape. Or if you want your character to always look tired, you can even do like a half circle to show that they're always either annoyed or tired. For this tutorial, I'm going to create a shape that's kind of half trapezoid and half circle. I'm going to create kind of like a semicircle on the top here. I'm going to create another curve that comes down like this, same on the other side, and then another curve at the bottom like this. And I'm going to make sure that this shape looks balanced on both sides. And just like that, I have the overall shape of my eye. When you're creating this general shape for your eye, this shape represents the inner part of the eyelash. If you have an eyelash that looks like this shape right here represents this part of the eyelash. The next thing we're going to do is sketch the inner part of our eyelash. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically just going to trace the top part of this eye right here. I'm then going to trace a little bit of this line right here. And I'm not going to trace this line. So here is my sketch compared to the overall drawing that I made. Make sure that your sketch looks like these parts like connect to each other. If anything looks off, like these lines don't connect or anything, you can always use the liquify tool just to adjust some positions you might be uncomfortable with. The next thing you're going to want to do is sketch how thick you want the eyelash to be. I usually like to make my eyelashes really thick, so I'm going to try to achieve something that's around that level of thickness. So I'm just going to create like a reference dot for myself so I know how wide I want it to be. And I'm going to try to create a line that is parallel to the top of my eyelash. If you don't like how thin or thick it is, you can always use the selection tool to move it up or down depending on your preference. The next thing you want to do is create a claw shape from this point of your inner eyelash right here to something that connects it to the outer part of your eyelash. Let's say this part extends over here. You can have this claw as thick as you want or as thin as you want, but it just needs to be a claw shape. So like that, that's fine to me. And then I'm going to erase any axis that I have here. The next thing we're going to want to do now is dictate how wide we want our bottom eyelash to be. I'm going to say I want it to be like around this thickness right here. And all I'm going to do is try to connect this point right here and this point right here to this point right here. So you're going to see just pretty much just like that. The next thing we're going to do is probably going to be the most fun part for you. We're going to sketch where our major eyelashes are going to be. So what I mean by that is the big eyelashes like this, not the little small ones like that. We're going to do the big eyelashes. Now, the general rule that I always have for this is that I always want at most 3 eyelashes. And the reason is because in my experience, having a lot of major eyelashes kind of just makes the eye look a little bit messy. It's a little bit harder to control more eyelashes, so I always like to use like 3 or 2. The next thing you want to make sure is that your eyelashes are going with the flow of the base that you created. So for example, if I were to make an eyelash right here, I'm making sure that this eyelash is going with the flow of this base right here. I'm not making an eyelash like this. This does not go with the flow. An easy way to go with the flow is just to like trace the top part of your eyelash and then just create a claw shape like that. This way you're making sure that you're going with the flow instead of creating something that kind of just interrupts the flow of the eyelash. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create one that goes like this and another one at the end of my eyelash like this. So for the bottom of the base, I actually like to create eyelashes that are perpendicular to the flow of the base. So for this one, I'm going to create a giant eyelash that goes toward the middle like this. And then a small one right here too. So these are going to be triangle shapes. They're going to be perpendicular with the flow of the eyelash. So if your eyelash was like this and you wanted to create an eyelash right here, it'd be perpendicular. The next thing we're going to do now is sketch what we want our iris to look like. So remember, the iris is like the actual circle part of your eye. Just based on your style, this shape can be anything. Some common shapes I've seen are ovals like this. I kind of like a milk jug, I guess. A milk jug shape. I don't know. The shape of the iris just depends to you. It doesn't really matter. So the shape that I'm going to use is kind of like a vase curve. So like, you know, a vase, like things that hold water or something. I'm going to use a vase curve, kind of like this. So I'm pretty much just going to create 2 curves that kind of connect to each other from the bottom. Like this. If you don't like the placement of it, remember, you can always use the selection tool to move it around. this is the shape that I want my iris to be in. And now we finally have the overall shape that we want our eye to be. And remember, if there's anything you don't like about the way you drew your eye, change it now, because it's going to be much harder to change the way our eye is structured later on. All right, now, this is probably going to be the hardest part of the tutorial, and it's going to be painting the shape of our eyelash. So the first thing you're going to want to do is fill this entire part of your eyelash with just plain black. I know this is still a sketch brush, but we're going to make it look smoother by the end of the tutorial. So don't pay attention to how harsh it's going to look. So pretty much for the third time, just trace your top and your bottom eyelash. Make it into a rectangle and then just fill it with black and then erase any excess that you have. And now you have this weird looking shape. The next thing we're going to want to do is go to our claw right here, and with the shading brush, just trace over the claw line that you created and then fill it with black. And so now you should have something that relatively looks like this. If it looks a little wobbly or anything, don't worry. We're going to be blurring a shit ton of this fucking thing anyways. And now the next thing you're going to want to do is do the bottom eyelash. Use the basic brush, trace over what you already had, and then just fill it with black. And then if there are any points that kind of look out of place, you could just erase them. Now, make sure everything is solid black. Make sure there's no like gaps of white or anything. Make sure everything is just pure solid black. The next thing you're going to want to do is now fill your eyelashes with black. What I'm going to do is create a new normal layer underneath the base of my eyelash. So I'll call this base so that, ooh, I spelled it nace. So this is the base of my eyelash. Create a new normal layer underneath this and just call it eyelash. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my marker tool. Now the reason I'm grabbing my marker tool is because it's sharp and it's solid. So we're going to use marker tool. And what we're going to do, I'm going to get something that's like relatively thick like this. And I'm going to try to achieve this eyelash shape by following the curvature, filling it. And then if anything just like looks off, I'm going to get a transparent brush and just erase what I don't need. So I want to make this flow with the eye. So make sure it flows with the eye. And then I kind of want to get like a sharper feel to it. So I'm going to add some more sharpness to it and then just erase what I don't need. What I'm going to do now is create two eyelashes that come out from our base right here. I'm going to make one that goes with the flow, and that's not too big. I'm going to make it like this. I'm going to erase a little bit inward so that I can get a nicer shape from the eyelash. And then I'm going to create a bigger eyelash, a little bit wider of an eyelash that comes out of that axis I created. I'm going to make sure it goes with the flow with the bottom of this inner eyelid too. And then the last thing I'm going to do is create a third eyelash that kind of comes out from the tip of the top of this eyelash right here. Now, if you have a black base that you're happy with, the next part we're going to do is add more form to our eyelash. And we're going to do this by creating a new clipping normal layer and picking a gray color. We're going to use a gray color, a plain gray color. We're going to change this color later on, but for right now, just use a plain gray color. What you're going to want to do is fill this entire part right here with gray. So with this gray, what we're going to do is give this eyelash more form. And the way we're going to be doing that is by erasing a certain shape of this gray that'll make basically the eyelash kind of look like this shape. You're going to see what I mean by in a second. So what I'm going to do is from the tip of this this eyelash right here, all the way like this, I'm going to erase the eyelash. Now, as you can see, now the eyelash looks more like a pyramid. This part is this gray shaded shape, and then this part is the black shaded shape. And the amount of gray you erase from the black shape just depends on what angle you want to convey. For this eyelash, we're going to be creating something that looks more like this. And for this eyelash, we made something that looks like this. Let's say if you had an eyelash right here, it would probably look something along like this. And be sure you're erasing with the transparent basic tool. I didn't say that, but be sure you're erasing with a transparent version of the basic tool. The next thing we're going to do is kind of add a secret eyelash to our drawing. Now, I know that I said you should have planned out these eyelashes during the sketching phase, but we're going to add like another little cute little eyelash just to add more form to the way our drawing looks. So what you're going to want to do is take a black and grab your marker tool. Let's make a new normal layer underneath it so we can merge it later. And what you're going to want to do is create just like a little triangle that's stemming out from the bottom of your eyelash right here. Now what you're going to want to do is just after you have your triangle and you're happy with the placement of it, just merge it with your eyelashes. The next thing we're going to do is come back to our gray normal layer right here. And with your basic brush, just add gray into here. And now what we're going to do is add a little curve to where this part of the gray and this part of the gray touch each other. So we're going to add a little bit of a curve here. It doesn't need to be perfect because we're going to blur it later. The next thing we're going to do is now we're going to add form to this bottom eyelash that we made. And so this eyelash is going to be basically pointing down like this part being the gray part and this part being the black part. So once again, grab a transparent basic brush and coming from the point of the tip of the eyelash, just erase the amount of gray that makes up this side of the eyelash. And then what you're going to want to do is create kind of like this shape, like if you're a math nerd, a natural log graph kind of shape. And then make sure the end of the line kind of follows the flow of the top of the eyelash. And then if you have any mistakes, just be sure to fill them back in. Now what we're going to do is erase like a little bit of a line on this part of the eyelash. So we're going to expose a little bit more black to one of the sides. So with the marker tool, I'm actually going to go back. And the last thing we're going to do is take our basic transparent brush and we're going to try to erase as little as we can of this top part right here of the gray shape. We want it to be noticeable, but we don't want to erase too much of this shape that we created. Try to make it all uniform thickness too. And so now we have this kind of shape. This dictates the form of this eyelash and a little bit of this top eyelash part right here. Now we're going to be adding gray to this part of the eyelash. Add gray that's not touching this gray, but just add gray over here. And then just fill this entire right side with gray. The first thing we're going to want to erase is we're going to want to follow the flow of this eyelash right here and just erase down from it. So like this. So now it looks like this eyelash is protruding from the base. So this is the eyelash right here, and this eyelash is kind of protruding from it, like it's going forward. It's sticking out forward from it. Now I'm going to select all of this gray part just so I don't end up erasing anything from the other side of the eyelash. Now what I'm going to do is, with a medium-sized basic brush, I'm going to go from the tip of this eyelash and erase what I feel like should be the second side of the eyelash. So as you can see, this gray part is one side, and then the black part is the other side. Then what I'm going to want to do is just erase half of this gray right here. So parallel to the inner part of the eye, just erase like half of it. And now what you want to do is kind of make this part of the gray part a little bit like more of a smoother transition. So what I'm going to do is just maybe erase some of this. And now the same thing, just erase a little bit of the top part. Like that. I think that looks good. And now this part looks a little boring to me, so what I'm going to do is create another eyelash like around here, around this part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new normal layer. I'm going to get my black marker tool, and I'm going to create an eyelash that just kind of pokes out like that. Then what I'm going to do is create a selection from this layer, and then click where your gray layer is, and then delete it. And then what you're going to do is bring this new normal layer that you made, bring it down to the eyelash base, and merge it with the eyelash base. And just like that, we have the eyelash base and then the gray part with this part erased. And then I'm going to add a little bit more layer to the end of this part right here. So now it looks thick and then it goes to thin. I like that. So now once you have this shape, we're going to go back and blur and smudge a lot of it. Because as you can see, we have a lot of harsh shapes that don't really blend well with each other. But we're gonna make them blend well with each other. Something you kind of want to practice is using your blur tool. You want to be able to like press lightly, press hard, and then go back to pressing lightly so that it creates kind of like a smooth transition of blur, because we're going to be doing that a lot. So the first thing you want to do is grab your smudge tool, and on this eyelash right here, you're going to want to go back and forth with this brush right here to create more of a smoother transition to the eyelash. And you're going to want to do the same, but with a smaller brush for this eyelash, like that. I would say just go back and forth once instead of this one where we went back and forth multiple times. And then I'm going to create a blur tool, and I'm just going to blur the inside of this so that it's more of a smoother transition. Now we're going to do the same thing for this eyelash right here. So grab like a medium-sized smudge tool, and we're just going to go just straight out with this part of it. We're just going to be going out. The next thing we're going to want to do is get a selection brush. get a lasso, and then just outline the shape of this triangle right here. Just try to follow like this shape that you have created with this eyelash right here. And then what you're going to want to do is inverse your selection, inverse selected area. Then what we're going to do is grab our blur tool, and we're going to do the thing we practiced earlier where we go from lightly pressing our blur to harshly pressing it. So we're going to lightly press it, and then harshly press it. So light and then harsh. And then from this side, we're going to do the same. Light and then harsh. Now your eyelash should kind of look like this, where it's like very harsh blur at the top and then not so harsh blur in the middle here. The next thing we're going to do is come to this claw right here and just lightly blur the middle of it like this, so that this part is blurred, but then it comes to like a rough shape. So kind of like that. Okay, now what we're going to do is go to our gray layer, and you might see some weird stuff like this. This is still pretty much just like the gray layer. I would go ahead and just erase everything that isn't these two shapes that you created here. Okay, it should be clean now. You can clip it back on. So now with your blur tool, what you're going to want to do is, on this side, go from light blur to harsh blur towards this middle part to light blur. You want to make sure the pointy parts of these triangles right here are not blurred. They're supposed to be sharp. So light blur to harsh blur to light blur. And then I get on this side, light blur to harsh blur to light blur. And then also make sure this part is also sharp. Now we're going to smoothen out the right side of our gray part. Grab your blur tool. Starting from right here, go from light to harsh, and then harsh to light. And then with your basic brush, just erase some of this part right here so that it looks like our eyelash, this eyelash is still here. Okay, so this transition kind of looks weird to me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my marker tool. I'm going to add like a little point right here that like kind of symbolizes another eyelash. And I'm going to bring this a little bit more inward right here. I'm going to curve it a little bit so that it looks smoother like this. Then from this point, I'm going to go light to harsh. And then make sure this part is light blurred. And then on this side, light to harsh. So one more thing I'm going to do is kind of thicken a little bit more the top of these eyelashes right here. So I'm going to create a normal layer underneath the base brush. I'm going to lightly, with the medium-sized shading brush, thicken this part right here. And then over here, thicken this part right here. And then I'm going to harshly blur it, and then probably lightly blur this one. And the last thing we're going to do is just add a little bit of eyelashes. So with a small marker with black, we're going to create another normal layer behind our base. And just wherever you want, just place little eyelashes. I suggest only placing like probably 2. I'm going to create one like at this part of the eyelash, and then at this part of the eyelash. And then another way you can make an eyelash is by erasing some of the part of your base eyelash. So what I like to do is just like, I like to make little erases that follow kind of the major eyelashes. I would put one like this here, but this eyelash right here is blocking it, so I'm not going to add that. But I like to erase some parts that follow the curvature of the major eyelashes. All right, now moving on to the bottom of the eyelash, which shouldn't be as hard as the top eyelash. What we're gonna do is we're gonna first blur the bottom of the eyelash, like that. And then we're gonna also lightly blur the middle of the eyelash right here. So what you should be doing is blurring a little bit of the inner eyelash and then blurring the outer eyelash a little bit more. Then what we're going to be doing is taking our smudge tool and just lightly smudging the ends of it, just so it's a little bit lighter of a transition. So like that. Now turn your sketch back on, make a new normal layer underneath the base, and then grab the marker tool, and what we're going to do is create our eyelashes that we sketched out earlier. So the same way you made the eyelashes for the top of the eye, and then just erase what you don't want. And I might rotate a little bit of my eyelashes, kind of put them, I actually might put them over here. I kind of want them to be protruding more from the bottom of the eyelash, so I might tilt them a little bit more. I want them to look like they're protruding more from the base of the eyelash. Then we're gonna merge these two layers together. Then what we're gonna do is grab our marker. The same way we did with this eyelash where we erased with the flow of the eyelash, we're gonna do the same with the bottom, but we're gonna erase it on the side of the eyelash that's pointing upward. So if you think about the form of this eyelash, it's technically like this. And we're gonna be erasing a little bit of the top side of the eyelash right here. Erase a little bit of the top of this eyelash. And then the same for this eyelash. And then I'm gonna blur where it looks sharp, because I didn't mean to add those. Now on the gray layer, grab our basic brush, and we're gonna use the same gray up here. We're gonna cover half of this bottom eyelash in gray. We're gonna blur the entire middle of it, so light to harsh. So lightly just blur it and then harshly blur it at the bottom. And then we're gonna grab our basic transparent tool, and we're just gonna erase where our eyelashes shapes intersect. And then I'm gonna blur it a little bit on the sharp edges. All right, so now that should practically be our eyelashes. The next thing we're gonna do is pretty much just edit some of the coloring to look a bit better, because this is pretty much just straight black and straight gray. So we're gonna add some, better colors. So the first thing we're gonna do is, alpha lock both of these so that you can't color outside of them. And we're gonna be using the airbrush tool to change the colors of these. So the first thing you wanna do is make a new clipping layer with normal. Take your airbrush, get a black color, and then just harshly put black just straight down like this. And this should kind of blacken out the middle of the gray part, so that it kind of looks like more of a nicer transition. And you can edit how dark you want it. I'm probably gonna go for something along the lines of that. So I kind of like that, more of a gradient. And the gray, it looks a little bit more softer, but it's still noticeable. The next thing we're gonna wanna do is add some tone to the gray that we used for the highlights of our eyelashes. As you can see, it's just plain gray, kind of boring looking. So what we're gonna do is add a warmer tone and make that go into more of a cooler tone. So to get a warm tone gray, what you're gonna wanna do is pick the gray you want, add a little bit of saturation, a very smidge bit of it, and then go towards red, up here. And then just cover it all in that color. As you can see now it looks a little bit more warm. And I'm gonna transition this into something more cool. So what I'm gonna do is bring this now down to a purple right here, and I'm gonna make the right side of this the purple. So now as you can see, there's a little bit of color now, so it goes from a warm gray to now a cool gray. And of course, if you want to, you can make it just all the same gray or all the same warmth, doesn't really matter. So now I'm gonna bring back the black that I had. As you can see now, it's starting to look way better. The next thing we're gonna do is go to our base, and we're gonna grab a dark brown color, kind of like that. And with our airbrush tool, we're gonna go on the right side, and on the bottom, down here, we're gonna add this brown. That's gonna add a little bit more color variety to our eyelash. So now, as you can see, there's a little bit more brown, and that looks nice. And the last thing that I like to do now is more of a stylistic thing. I like to kind of outline the outer parts of the eyelash with a just straight black. So for example, I'm going to take my highlight tool and just kind of outline the edge of it just with this black. And remember, this is just a stylistic thing. You don't really have to do this. The reason I do this is because I feel like it makes the eye pop more if it's being covered by hair or something. That's the only reason I do this. You don't have to if you don't want to, but I'm going to because I like to. All right, so we're finally now done with the eyelash. The next thing I'm going to want to do is now we're going to make the sclera, which is the white part of the eye. And this is pretty easy. All you have to do is first get a color that you can clearly see so you know where you're putting the white at. On the left side, we're just going to blur it. And then we're in any gaps that you have, you're also going to want to blur it. What you're going to want to do is pick a white, but pick like an off-white. Something that isn't like literally just plain white. Yeah, I'll do like a cool white. So like this is like a cool white. As you can see, it's clearly not white, more of a bluish white. So that's your sclera. The next thing we're going to do is make our iris. So what we're going to just pretty much do is just find the sketch of your iris and then just fill it with black like this. And then you can smooth it if you want to, but is it really going to matter? Because we're going to blur it anyways. And now what we're going to do is blur it so that these edges right here are like harshly blurred. The bottom of it is sharp. And then we're going to make the edges lightly blurred. And then in the middle of here, we're going to do a more harsh blur. So harsh blur to light blur to sharp. And then the next thing we're going to do is just duplicate this layer so that it's a little bit more thicker. So now your eye should look like this. And then you can go back and fix it all you want. I'm probably going to do that because for some reason it just looks weird to me. All right, so this next part is the most fun part of this video. We're finally going to be able to color in the iris. So, you know, feel free to basically do whatever you want at this point, since this is like a huge part of an artist's art style. So from this point out, I'm gonna color the iris in my style, which you can follow. So if there's something you don't like about my style, you could just simply not add it in. So before we continue, just double check the way your folders are organized. So basically I have my eyelash all in one folder. I have my sclera and my iris in their own folder. And then I'm going to create a new folder, put my iris base in it. So now this base is in the folder. I'm going to call this folder iris, and I'm going to be clipping this to the to the sclera. So it should be here, eyelash, sclera folder, inside the sclera folder, an iris folder clipped onto the sclera, and then inside the iris is the base. Also, I'm not going to show you how to get a color scheme because I've done that before. So if you want to learn how to get a color scheme, just check out this old ass video that I have that is still relevant to this day. So this is going to be my color scheme. If you want to follow the way I colored the eye, you can copy this color scheme. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new layer and clip it onto the base of my iris. The next thing I'm going to do is select the base color of my eye. So like my character's true eye color. And I'm going to fill this entire part of the iris with this color. And then I'm going to also make sure that I'm leaving an edge of the base. I'm not going to cover the entire thing. Don't cover the entire thing. Leave like a little bit of the edge of the base. I'm then going to grab my blur tool and just lightly blur the entire bottom half of this iris. Then grab a transparent basic brush, and what you're going to do is basically cut half of your coloring in half. So cut it in half, and be sure you're cutting it half in a way that there's a little bit of a curve to it. So if you notice, I'm not like straight up cutting it in half. I'm adding a little bit of a curve inside of it. Then grab your blur tool, lightly blur the middle, and then add a harsh blur to the edges. So you want to be edging. You want to edge the edge. Fuck. You want to you want to edge. What fuck? You want to blur the edge. You want to harshly blur this part of the eye, and then not blur the middle so much so that it looks like this. The next thing I'm going to do is grab an airbrush tool, transparent, and I'm going to lightly go over a little bit more of the edges. The next thing we're going to do is grab our first shading color of the base color. So if this is my base color, this is my first shading color. And what I'm going to do is basically grab my shading brush, and I'm going to add, make sure to alpha lock. I'm going to add a giant U. I'm going to basically add a giant U and color the entire bottom of this part of my iris in this shading color. The next thing you want to do is grab your blur tool, and you want to leave the upper halves of this U shape hard. So what you want to do is just pretty much blur the bottom side of it, and then a harsh blur at the very bottom of it. So it goes from hard to harsh blur to hard. Next, what you want to do is grab your airbrush tool, grab the base color of your eye, and just lightly go under this U that you created with the base color. It should look a lot softer. The next thing we're going to do is make our pupil. So grab your darkest shading color. So what you want to do is just make a pill shape like this at the bottom. More of an oval shape than a pill shape, I guess. The next thing you want to do is grab your shading brush, your first shading color, and what you want to do is make a U underneath your iris. And then what we're going to do is we're going to grab our blur tool and go from light to harsh blur to light blur. And then you're going to want to grab your airbrush tool, take your base color, and then just in the middle of this U that you created, go over lightly so that it looks like it's fading in. The next thing you want to do is grab your basic brush, get your main color again, your base color, and then just cut off the pupil right underneath the black part. So just like that. The next thing you want to do is make a new clipping layer underneath this layer that you've been working on. So now we have a new clipping layer. Grab your third shading color, grab the shading brush, and just on the top of the upper half of this eye right here, just lightly go over with your third shading color. Next thing you want to do is grab the blur tool and just lightly blur all of it and then harshly blur it on the sides. So it should look like this. And then just change the opacity to where it's kind of barely noticeable. And then what you can do is just merge this layer to the base. This is pretty much what your base looks like. And then this is on top of the base. The next thing we're going to do is create a new clipping layer. Set this to lighten. And then grab this color, which I just picked out. If you don't have it, you could just look at these values. And then with your basic brush, create a big circle that's barely almost gonna touch the half of your eye, but that is not touching the half of your eye. Next, what you want to do is, because this is technically indirect lighting, this eyelash right here would be blocking it. So the way we're gonna show that it's blocking it is we're gonna erase just a triangle right here to show that this eyelash right here is blocking this indirect lighting, and we're gonna lightly blur it. And then just lightly blur the bottom half. Don't blur it so hard, just lightly blur it. Then what you're gonna wanna do is grab a transparent color airbrush tool and then just go over the upper half of this part. So just the upper half, erase it a little bit. And then just turn down the opacity to whatever you feel like looks like a really good reflection. Next thing we're gonna do is create a new clipping layer, pick overlay, get your basic brush, and then create a color that's lighter than your base color. So I have here, this is a color that is lighter than my base color. And what you're gonna wanna do is just create a giant circle right here, and then just adjust it to where you want. Then I'm gonna get a blur tool and just lightly blur the top half of it. The next thing we're gonna do is create the shadow of our eye. So what you're gonna do is create a new clipping layer and clip it to the sclera. So we should have the sclera, then the iris, and then our shadow. And now what I'm gonna do is pick a dark blue color, or I guess this is a very saturated purple. But you're gonna wanna pick a very dark saturated purple. And then what we're gonna do is take our shading brush and cover the half that is black. So like follow the flow, and then get a blur tool and lightly just blur it in the middle. And then what we wanna do is grab an airbrush tool, set it to a transparent color, and then just lightly go over the top half. And now you should have a shadow. Then you can just change the opacity to whatever you feel comfortable with. The next thing we're gonna do is literally everyone's favorite part. We're gonna be adding eye shinies. I'm gonna be creating different types of eye shinies that you can add to your art. You don't have to like do one of each type. You can just do one of a certain type. And I'm gonna show you like different types that I like doing, basically. So what you first wanna do is create a new clipping layer and make a normal layer. What I'm gonna do is grab my highlights brush and make it very big. This is the type of highlights that I like doing. I like doing very small highlights that are barely noticeable. It's like less is more. That's how I feel about it. It like looks really cool. So what I'm gonna do is just end up making just random dots. There's really no rhyme or reason like where you should be making these dots. Just literally anywhere where you want them. So I'm gonna create a little dot right there. And then, I don't know, I'm gonna do a very saturated blue and add it right here for no reason. The next thing I'm gonna do is make one that's a little triangle, actually. So I'm gonna create like a little block right here that I can erase. And then I'm just gonna erase this until it looks like a very small triangle. I'm gonna make one down here as well. A blob, and then just erase it into a triangle. The next type of shiny I'm going to make is like a major shiny. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab my white brush, a basic brush, and up here I'm gonna make sort of like a big triangle shape, like a rounded triangle. So now I have a rounded triangle. And you might be asking yourself, how is this different from the dots? Well, what we're gonna do is we're gonna select this triangle, we're gonna copy and paste it, we're gonna alpha lock it, pick a very saturated orange, color half of it in orange, and then get a very saturated like blue, and then color half of it with blue. And then you're going to set this layer to add glow, and you're going to notice that nothing fucking happened. Well, alpha lock it, go to filter, and then blur it. And then if you lightly blur it, you're going to notice that it's starting to like leak light. And that just looks super cool. I might change it to be all orange maybe. Yeah, all orange. I'm going to leave it to be all orange. But you can also set it to blue. Like blue also looks cool. But I'm going to set it to be all orange. And then I'm going to create another dot underneath this one. Like that. That looks cool. Another type of shiny that you can do is I'm going to come down here and make kind of like a medium-sized dot. And then I'm going to make a new clipping normal layer. I'm going to add some white underneath this dot that I made. And then I'm going to grab my blur tool, blur underneath it, and then set this to add glow. And this basically adds another white dot that basically kind of leaks its light. And I think that's pretty cool. The next type of highlight that we're going to make is we're going to get the highlights 2 brush. I'm going to pick like, I don't know, maybe probably just this color right here. And I'm going to add a little pill-shaped looking thing to the bottom of the iris right here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my shading brush and kind of outline this color in the same color as my iris. And then what I'm going to do is lightly blur it in the middle. Probably not too much. And I like this type of highlight because it looks like it's kind of bending the light around it. So like as you see, like the iris is following the shape and then it's being bent. I like that. It looks cool to me. And then the last type of reflection we can do is we're going to get the highlights 2 brush. I'm going to get, you know, my second shading color, I guess. And then I'm going to just create like a big ball just somewhere random, like that. And then what I'm going to do is set this to add glow. And then just lower the opacity to where it's kind of barely noticeable. And that's another type of reflection you can do. And then the last reflection I'm going to add is I'm going to create a new clipping layer. I'm going to grab my basic brush. I'm going to just make a huge streak of light like this. So basically just like a long line that kind of follows the curvature of the eye. And I'm going to just erase some of this so it makes like a huge kind of trapezoid. And then I'm just going to erase some lines that kind of follow the curvature of the eye. And then I'm going to blur the bottom half of it. Set this to lighten. And then just turn down the opacity. And then, I don't know, the last thing we can do is add something with our airbrush tool. Let's get like an orange color. So let's get like a contrasting color and add like an airbrush tool on top of here. And then we're going to set this to add glow. And you can just turn down the opacity and it adds a little bit of a contrasting color to your eye. And those are pretty much like all the types of reflections that you can do with your eye. Just go ham on it. There's no such thing as too many shinies when it comes to anime. So, I mean, you can leave your eye like this, but what I'm going to show you now is I'm going to add some more things to the base of my iris. I feel like my iris looks a little dull. I'm going to show you more things you can do to your iris to make it look even better. So the first thing we can do is kind of play around with our pupil. What I'm going to do is grab my highlight brush, and I'm basically going to make a bunch of lines that kind of go inside the iris, like this. Like that. I basically, with my highlight brush, just make a bunch of like lines that just go inside. And then do the opposite. Make a bunch of lines that go outside with the color of the iris. The next thing we're going to do is grab our smudge brush, and we're just going to vary between smudging outside and inside of our iris. So right here, I'm going to smudge inside my iris, and then right here, I'm going to smudge outside my iris. There's not really like correct way to do it, just depending on what you want. Just make sure you're alternating between smudging in and smudging out. The next thing you want to do is get the basic brush, pick white, and then make a new normal layer. Just make a normal looking triangle. What we're going to do is I'm going to put this in a folder because I'm going to duplicate this triangle a lot of times and make sure all the triangles are pointing towards the iris. And also make sure that you're alternating the size and position of these triangles. So I'll show you once I'm done. And then merge this layer. And then you're going to create another layer of triangles in the same way, but just a different pattern. So now I have 2 different layers of triangles organized in different ways. And now I'm going to put both of these groups of triangles in their own folder. And then what you want to do is duplicate these rows of triangles. So I'm going to duplicate this and then hide this one. And just adjust their sizing based on how close they're going to be to the iris, or the pupil, my bad. So I'm going to make this very small, put it close to the pupil. I'm going to duplicate this one. And then I'm going to put this probably a little bit farther away from the pupil. So like that. And then I'm going to duplicate this one. Put her a little bit farther away from the pupil, so it has to be bigger, like this. And then I'm going to edit this one to be like, not that one. I'm going to edit this one to be around medium. And then this kind of looks a little repetitive, so I might kind of like rotate some of these triangles just so your brain doesn't really recognize a pattern with these triangles. Now what we're going to do is set this folder with all the triangles to glow dodge. And then we're going to change all of their opacities to 50. And the reason we're doing this individually is so that like their brightness stacks. I'm actually going to make it maybe a little bit more dark, maybe like 25. And then what we're going to do is we're going to merge all of these together. And now we're going to merge this layer together. And then we're going to grab our blur tool. And we're just going to blur all of the bottoms of the triangles. So try not to blur the points of these triangles, like where they're pointing in the direction of the iris. Just try to blur the bottom of them. And what we're going to do is we're going to shade it the closest triangles as red. And the farther the triangle is, we're going to go through the entire rainbow spectrum. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill them all with red first. And then what I'm going to do is now I'm going to go to orange. And I'm going to put some orange. And then what I'm going to do is get the green. Put the green like this. Blue. And then I'm going to do blue at the farthest away. And then purple. And then farthest away is purple. So as you can see, now it's going from red through the rainbow the farther it gets from the eye. And then I'm actually going to change this layer to add glow. I'm sorry about that. I messed it up. It's supposed to be add glow, not glow dodge. But you should be able to change that easily. And then get your airbrush tool, set it to a transparent color. And then what we're going to do is lightly just erase like this. Now it has less opacity the closer it is. And the farther away it is more noticeable. And then what I'm going to do is just adjust the opacity. And then maybe I'm going to go back with my blur tool and just blur a little bit. Just like add little pinches of blur. And now when you zoom out, it should look like there's like a rainbow coming out of the pupil. And it looks cool. You can adjust the opacity if you want. Maybe you can adjust the layer style if you want. But I found out that add glow is like the best for me. So yeah, now it should look like there's a rainbow coming out of your eye. And the last thing we want to do is grab our indirect lighting color. So this color that I came up with. Make a new normal clipping layer. And just add a little dot right here. And then just change the opacity to be like 30%. And then slightly blur the top of it. The next thing we want to do is come to the actual layer where this color is, like this coloring is. Grab the highlights brush, get the base color of your eye, and then from the pupil, just make lines coming out. So like this. And then that's it. Don't blur them, don't do anything, just have the lines coming out like that. And then if some of your elements aren't showing up, you can rearrange the order in which they appear. So the reflection that we added up here isn't showing so well, so I'm going to put it at the top here so that it's more visible. So then we brought back the reflectiveness of that layer. And that's it. You are now finished with your eye. If you made it to the end, I would love for you to post it on Instagram and tag me in it. My Instagram name is the same as my YouTube name. I will share it on my story for everyone to see. If you'd like to see other advanced concepts, check out this video where I talk about 5 common mistakes even intermediate artists do, and you could fix them right now. I promise you'll love it.